there are many lessons to take from this day, just there are many memories that fill the space of this church. As I was thinking about which ones we needed to remember at this hour, my mind went back to the very beginning of the modern civil rights era. Because before Memphis and the mountaintop, before the bridge in Selma and the March on Washington, before Birmingham and the beatings, the fire hoses, and the loss of those 4 little girls, before there was King the Icon and his magnificent dream, there was King the young preacher and a people who found themselves suffering under the yoke of oppression. And on the eve of the bus boycotts in Montgomery, at a time when many were still doubtful about the possibilities of change, a time when there were those in the black community who not only mistrusted each other, but mistrusted themselves, King inspired with words not of anger, but of an urgency, a fierce urgency that still speaks to us today. Unity, he said, is the great need of the hour. Unity is the great need of the hour. Unity is how we shall overcome. What Dr. King understood is that if just one person chose to walk instead of ride the bus, those walls of oppression would not be moved. But maybe if a few more decided to walk, those foundations might start to shake. If just a few women were willing to do what Rosa Parks had been willing to do, maybe the cracks in those walls would start to show. If teenagers took rides from north to south, maybe a few bricks would come loose. Maybe if white folks marched because they had come to understand that their freedom was wrapped up in the freedom of others, that they too had a stake in the impending battle, the walls would begin to sway. And if enough Americans were awakened to injustice, if they joined together, north and south, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile, then perhaps that wall would come tumbling down, and justice would flow like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Unity is the great need of the hour. That's what Dr. King said. And it is the great need of this hour as well. Not because it sounds pleasant, not because it makes us feel good, but because it's the only way we can overcome the essential deficit that exists in this country. I'm not talking about the budget deficit. I'm not talking about the trade deficit. I'm talking about the moral deficit in this country. I'm talking about an empathy deficit. The inability to recognize ourselves in one another. To understand that we are our brother's keeper and our sister's keeper. That in the words of Dr. King, we are all tied together in a single garment of destiny. We have an empathy deficit when we're still sending our children down corridors of shame, schools in the forgotten corners of America, where the color of your skin still affects the content of your education. We have a deficit when CEOs are making more in 10 minutes than ordinary workers are making an entire year. When families lose their homes so unscrupulous lenders can make a profit. When mothers can't afford a doctor, when their children are stricken with illness. We have a deficit in this country when we have Scooter Libby, justice for some, and Gina, justice for others. When our children see hanging nooses from a schoolyard tree today, in the present, in the 21st century. We have a deficit when homeless veterans sleep on the streets of our cities, when innocents are slaughtered in the deserts of Darfur, when young Americans serve tour after tour after tour after tour of duty in a war that should have never been authorized and should have never been waged. We have an empathy deficit in this country that has to be closed. We have a deficit when it takes a breach in the levees to reveal the breach in our compassion, when it takes a terrible storm to reveal the hungry that God calls on us to feed, the sick that he calls on us to care for, the least of these that he commands that we treat as our own. So we have a deficit to close. We have walls, barriers to justice and equality that must come down. And to do this, we know that unity is the great need of the hour. However, all too often when we talk about unity in this country, we've come to believe that it can be purchased on the cheap. We've come to believe that racial reconciliation can come easily, that it's just a matter of a few ignorant people trapped in the prejudices of the past, and that if the demagogues and those who would exploit our racial divisions will simply go away, then all our problems will be solved. All too often, we seek to ignore the profound structural and institutional barriers that stand in the way of ensuring opportunity for all of our children, or decent jobs for all of our people, or health care for those who are sick. We long for unity, but we are not willing to pay the price that's required. Of course, true unity cannot be so easily purchased. It starts with a change in attitudes. It starts with changing our hearts and changing our minds, broadening our spirit. It's not easy to stand in somebody else's shoes. It's not easy to see past our own differences. We've all encountered this in our own lives. What makes it even more difficult is that we have a politics in this country that seeks to drive us apart, that puts up walls between us. We are told that those who differ from us on a few things differ from us on all things, that our problems are the fault of those who don't think like us or look like us or come from where we do. The welfare queen, she's taken our money. The immigrant, he's taken our jobs. The believer condemns the non-believer as immoral. And the non-believer chides the believer for being intolerant. And for most of this country's history, we in the African American community have been at the receiving end of man's inhumanity to man. And all of us understand intimately the insidious role that race still sometimes plays on the job and in the schools, in our healthcare system and in our criminal justice system. And yet, if we are honest with ourselves, we must admit that none of our hands are entirely clean. If we're honest with ourselves, we'll acknowledge that our own community has not always been true to King's vision of a beloved community. If we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit that there have been times when we've scorned our gay brothers and sisters instead of embracing them. The scourge of anti-Semitism has at times revealed itself in our community. For too long, some of us have seen immigrants only as competitors for jobs instead of companions in the fight for opportunity. Every day, our politics fuels and exploits this kind of division across all races and regions, across gender and party. It is played out on television. It is sensationalized by the media. Last week, it crept into the campaign for president with charges and countercharges that serve to obscure the issues instead of illuminating the critical choices we face as a nation. None of our hands are clean. So let us say that on this day of all days, each of us carries with us the task of changing our hearts and minds. The divisions, the stereotypes, the scapegoating, the ease with which we blame the plight of ourselves on others, all of that distracts us from the common challenges that we face: war and poverty, inequality and injustice. We can no longer afford to build ourselves up by tearing each other down. We can no longer afford to traffic in lies or fear or hate. There's the poison that we must purge from our politics, the wall that we must tear down before the hour grows too late. Because if Dr. King could love his jailer, if he could call on the faithful who once sat where you do to forgive those who had set dogs and fire hoses upon them, then surely we can look past what divides us in our time and bind up our wounds and erase the sympathy deficit that exists in our hearts. But if changing our hearts and our minds is the first critical step, we cannot stop there. It's not enough to bemoan the plight of the poor in this country or remain unwilling to push our elected officials to provide the resources to fix our schools. It's not enough to decry the disparities of health care and yet allow the insurance companies and the drug companies to block real reform in our health care system. It's not enough for us to abhor the costs of a misguided war, and yet we continue to allow ourselves to be driven by a politics of fear that sees the threat of an attack as a way to scare up votes instead of a call to come together in a common effort. Scripture tells us that we are judged not just by word, but by deed. And if we are truly to bring about the unity that is needed, that is so crucial in this time, we have to find it within ourselves to act on what we know, to understand that living up to this country's ideals and its possibilities is going to require great effort and great resources, sacrifice and stamina. We can't pass a law called No Child Left Behind and then leave the money behind. That is not a serious effort in bringing about the unity that is needed. We can't celebrate Dr. King's dream and yet still have insufficient funds to cash that promissory note that was promised at the beginning of this nation. And that is what is at stake in this great debate we are having today. Changes that are needed are not just a matter of tinkering around the edges. They will not come if politicians simply tell us what we want to hear. All of us will be called upon to make some sacrifice. None of us will be exempt from responsibility. We have to fight to fix our schools, but we also have to challenge ourselves to be better parents and turn off the television set and put away the video game. And our men have to be home with our children. That too is part of the challenge that we must meet. We will have to confront the biases in our criminal justice system, but we also have to acknowledge the deep-seated violence that still resides in our own communities, in too many of the hearts of our young people, and we have to break the grip of that violence wherever we see it. That's how we're going to bring about the change that we seek. That's how Dr. King led this country through the wilderness. He did it with words that he spoke not just to the children of slaves, but the children of slave owners. Words that inspired not just black, but also white, not just Christian, but also Jew and Muslim and Buddhist